Thank you so much, Susan. Thank you to all of you at Great IT Pro for putting on these fabulous events for the PMO and project management community and all of the organizations you're helping around the world to make a big impact. I love being a part of it. All right, everyone, I am super excited to have you here. We are going to dive in and have a great deal of fun. Definitely make sure that you share your questions in the chat. I will make sure there is time to answer all of those questions very, towards the end of this. So I'm going to go through all of this content, give you some ideas, some ways to think differently, some ways to really help earn your seat at the table in your organization, and then take time to answer your specific questions about how might you solve some of these challenges you have in your particular organization. So with that, let's do this. All right, so here's where we start. First, we're going to start at the top. You see, many executives struggle with effectively delivering strategy. And if we're going to close the strategy execution gap, we need to be looking at that. And most don't realize that the answer is right in front of them in the form of you, in the form of the PMO. So today you're going to discover the critical role the PMO can play in finally closing this strategy to execution gap, where to focus your efforts, and why the PMO is the most important strategic asset your organization has for achieving high value outcomes for the strategy consistently. So where do we need to start if that's our goal? We need to start by understanding strategy. And step one is really about putting yourself in the shoes of your business leaders. So my goal is to ensure that you as a PMO leader earn your rightful seat at the table in your organization so that you can become what I call the strategy navigator for the organization, which positions you to help that organization deliver on their strategy most effectively. But this means that we have to start thinking and acting like business leaders if we want that seat at the table. And if you think, okay, I'm already acting like a business leader, I got you, then you should be nodding your head a great deal on the coming slides. And I want to hear about that in the chat and in the Q&A at the end. We must understand first what our business leaders, our executives are dealing with when it comes to this whole strategy process. So we're going to start with some basic definitions, but you'll see in a minute really why these definitions are so critical to our starting point, okay? So let's start right at the beginning. What do we mean when we say strategy? And what is strategy or strategic management really all about? If you've heard business leaders say that they need you or your PMO or your team to become more strategic, this is for you. And I think you're going to be thrilled when you see that it's actually a lot simpler than you think. So some basic definitions around strategy. Here's the dictionary definition. A plan of action or policy designed to achieve a major or overall aim. Time to develop a coherent economic strategy. Okay, so we have this strategy word here, which is really just a plan of action. Okay, so let's try another definition just to be sure. All right, strategy is a general plan to achieve one or more long-term or overall goals under conditions of uncertainty. Okay, I heard plans, goals, and uncertainty. So let's pause there for a second. Let's see, what other field of practice uses those words a lot? Anyone have any guesses to that? Feel free to put it in the chat if you've got any ideas on what other field that we might all be familiar with uses plans, goals, and uncertainty quite a bit. To me, this sounds like the description of every project ever done. It all starts with plans, goals, and uncertainty. And yes, sometimes there's much more of that uncertainty part right at the beginning. Absolutely. And that's kind of the point, right? Because the idea is to take that uncertainty and turn it into something that we can actually measure and deliver and achieve value for, right? That's kind of the point. It starts with uncertainty and we put plans and goals, well, goals together and then we use plans to achieve those goals. All right, so we're talking about building a plan to deliver on an outcome, right? All right, so let's keep going. Strategic management. In the field of management, strategic management, very special here, involves the formulation and implementation of the major goals and initiatives, aka projects, taken by an organization as managers on behalf of stakeholders, also one of our favorite words, based on consideration of resources, the problem we always have, right? Not enough, and an assessment of the internal and external environments in which the organization operates, aka requirements. Okay, so look at these words: management, implementation, goals, initiatives, organization, stakeholders, resources, and then that sneaky one in there, requirements. What part of that doesn't scream project management? So strategic management, aka project management of a strategy, is pretty much right in our wheelhouse, right? Okay, so let's keep going. Strategic management, another definition. It's funny because when I did a ton of research on, well, what's the challenge here? How do I start this to kind of baseline us all on this strategy and strategic management? Let's see what the actual definitions are. It was right in our wheelhouse. Okay, strategic management is the management of organizations' resources to achieve its goals and objectives. Strategic management involves setting objectives, analyzing, aka business analysis, the competitive environment, analyzing the internal organization, looking for those change management opportunities, evaluating strategies, and ensuring the management rolls out, aka does projects, to roll out those strategies across the organization. Okay, so by now, it should be clear to all of you that we're talking about setting goals, delivering on those goals, and ensuring that those goals achieve the intended business outcomes. It's that simple. So when your business leaders are asking you to be more strategic, or if you're trying to determine if your PMO is strategic, the answer is simply yes. You're helping the organization deliver on strategy with the highest possible return on investment you can, as quickly as possible. That is what you're there to do. And I don't care if you're, in a functional department, or, oh no, we're over in IT, or, oh, we don't do strategy stuff. You do, or you should be. And if you're not, then I'm wondering, if you're not aligned to the goals of the organization, if you're not aligned to the strategy of the organization, what is your purpose? So let's keep going here. When business leaders say to be more strategic, what they're really saying is, think big picture. Help me see how all of these pieces come together to achieve our goals. The PMO can complete the puzzle of aligning the strategy and the vision to the outcomes the business leaders are looking for, but to do so, you'll have to put the right services in place in the right ways at the right time to support that strategy lifecycle, that strategy process. They want you, if they're asking you to be more strategic, they want you to see the whole puzzle and all its pieces instead of simply focusing on the execution parts of the process. Okay? So they're looking for you to be involved in helping guide them, be what I call a strategy navigator, guide them on the journey of their strategy process. All right, so everyone with me so far? So with all that in mind, let's continue to walk a mile in our executives' shoes so we can look at the challenges that they are experiencing in achieving those intended business outcomes. The reason they're screaming for you to be more strategic is that they need help with their strategy lifecycle. And here's some information that supports that. Number one, 60% of organizations don't link their budgets to their corporate strategy. Now, for some of you, you might be thinking, how is that possible that we only have 60% of our organizations out there linking their budgets to their corporate strategy? Meaning the strategy is developed and then the budget planning process is completely separate for that. Now, some of you on here, and I'd love to see it in the chat, you're probably thinking, that literally describes exactly how we do things. And that might be an underlying root cause, which we'll come back to later, of some of the challenges that you're experiencing. All right, let's keep going. It gets even better. 67% of HR and IT departments don't link their priorities to the corporate strategy. So let's see, HR, in addition to often managing organizational change initiatives, in addition to often being responsible for the staffing of the resources that we need in order to deliver on these projects, And then IT, are you kidding me? IT not being linked to the corporate strategy? IT is a service organization that provides services and capabilities so that the organization can deliver on strategy. Same thing the PMO does. Same thing many of these other parts of the organizations do. So if many of them, 2/3 of them, are not linking the work they do to the organization's strategy, what are they doing? Are they just making it up as they go along? 75% of middle managers don't have incentives linked to the organization strategy. So if 3/4 of managers in organizations are not measured by how well the strategy is delivered, but in theory are doing projects and driving projects and managing the people that are supposed to deliver on that strategy, it's no wonder we have such a gap. And a lot of these gaps really don't have anything to do with the PMO, do they? 95%, this is the scariest one for me. 95% of the typical workforce doesn't understand what their company strategy even is. And I've seen this play out in organizations. 95% of the typical workforce doesn't understand their company's strategy. So how can we expect our organizations to achieve their business strategy if most of the people, almost all of the people in the organization, don't even know what the strategy is? They don't know what the goals are. They don't know what the plan is. They don't know what they're trying to accomplish. They don't understand the stakeholders. They don't understand the people that are supposed to be doing the work to get that strategy to be realized. They don't understand any of the process. So if that's the case, it's no wonder there's this strategy execution gap that we can't ever seem to close. And what we're here to talk about today, 61% of executives struggle to bridge the gap between strategy formulation and implementation. So if that's the world we're dealing with, that's where the business leaders are today. Now we need to talk about all of you. Now is where things actually get really fun, because if 61% of executives are struggling to close the gap to achieve their intended business outcomes, where are the places the PMO might be able to help? And this is actually where it gets fun, okay? So first, let's look at what is the role of the PMO in helping the organization deliver on strategy? Well, for years, many of you may be familiar with the PMI Pulse of the Profession surveys. These are surveys that are done that track what works in organizations around the world. When organizations are having success and they tie that to the PMO or to project management, why do they think they were successful? What are the contributing factors? And one data point that has become pretty clear over multiple Pulse of the Profession surveys, and hello, it just kind of makes sense. We need to understand that the alignment of the PMO to the goals of the organization is that key to driving strategy implementation, okay? Not just strategy delivery, but the entire life cycle of the strategy process. So let's talk about what that actually looks like. To keep things very simple, we're going to look at a very simple strategy life cycle. You define the value you'd like to achieve, you create that value, and then you realize the outcomes for that strategy. So value defined, value created, value realized. Very simple strategy process, okay? So if that's how strategy happens in an organization, and we'll get into whether or not it's successful in a minute, but if that's how strategy happens in an organization, where are things going wrong? What is this gap that they're talking about? All right, so you may have heard some of these books or articles on closing the strategy to execution gap. That was the name of this session here today. And yet we still seem to, if there's so many books out there, there's so many articles, there's so many people saying, I've got the solution. You might be thinking, Laura, you're saying that yourself. Sort of. Then why is it that we still have this pretty significant gap? Those statistics we just looked at would tell you that that gap ain't closed and that there is a real significant problem here. So if that gap still exists, we need to look at how we would actually close that gap and what, the role the PMO can play in that. Because you might be thinking, well, a lot of these are business problems, not me problems. But let me tell you, my friend, these are you problems. These are problems that you actually are strategically positioned to solve, no matter where your PMO sits in an organization, because you have a unique skill set. We'll talk about that more in a minute. But first, let's talk about this gap. And I'll tell you why. There's a couple of reasons why this closing strategy execution gap fails. And one of them is our definition of this gap. You see, there's that strategy definition process, and there's that gap there between strategy definition and strategy delivery. But there's another gap that a lot of people aren't talking about between that strategy delivery and the strategy realized. So remember, we had the value defined, value created, value realized, but we actually have more than one gap that we need to close. There's two gaps. One being between that strategy definition, strategy delivery, the other being between that delivery and realized. And both of those are unique opportunities for PMO leaders and PMOs to come in and help. Now, there are also sometimes there are challenges with your strategy being poorly defined, okay? And that could be a contributing factor to a lot of the downstream challenges that we see when the projects actually get started, is that the strategy is not clearly defined. Especially when that, so if we make the assumption the strategy definition is done well and it's not, then that could be part of our problem. But even if we were to go as far as to say that the strategy is well defined, now, if 95% of the workers in an organization don't understand the strategy, clearly there's a problem. It's either not well defined or it's not well communicated. And that both of those are significant challenges that the PMO could potentially facilitate solving. And we'll look at that in a minute. But there's another problem that we're going to talk about today as well, which is that when we presume that we understand the problem, therefore we presume we understand the solution, and the solution is actually the solution we think that we should implement to solve this strategy to execution gap is actually probably not helping us all that much, which is why the problems are perpetuating. So the reason I think that we continue to fail in closing the strategy to execution gap is because we're misdiagnosing the problems and we're assuming that there's only one gap. So let's look at this a little bit further and figure out how this all plays out, okay? So going back to that strategy definition, delivery, realized process, where does project management fit into all of this? Now, regardless of implementation lifecycle that you choose, you are delivering projects to benefit this strategy, to deliver on this strategy. Even if you are doing projects that are, more tactical or technical, they still should be rolling up to the business goals of the organization. Remember the definition we looked at. The strategy is about the defining the business goals for the organization and then delivering on those goals, and then making sure that they achieve the intended business outcomes. So regardless of life cycle, these are the kinds of things that happen to take that strategy through from definition to realize, okay? So you have ideas that are developed, projects that are approved, planning and delivery of those projects. And this is where you could have any implementation lifecycle. You can do any of the million different variations of Agile. You could do waterfall. You could do Scrum, an example of Agile. You could do a hybrid approach. You could do what many people are calling Agile, the waterfall Agile hybrid, right? It doesn't really matter here for the purposes of this. You want to use the implementation methodology that helps you achieve the biggest bang for your buck and get to those results as fast as possible in the most effective ways possible. Not just get through the project the fastest, but actually get to the business outcomes, all this stuff over here that many in project world, the people that are managing the projects, aren't actually around to be a part of. So that's part of the challenge we'll talk about in a second here. So let's go back to value defined, value created, value realized. The project lifecycle mapped to the strategy process. So again, we've got an important part over here in value realized that is often shortchanged when we look at project management, where we have an opportunity for PMOs. Now, here's what tends to happen, and we'll go through this in detail in a second, but for now, just keep in mind, when you as a PMO leader were hired to go solve this strategy to execution gap, or they were saying that there were problems with the project management Like project management isn't working. We're not achieving the benefits. I'll give you a bunch of those complaints, those pain points you hear in a second. This is where the PMO tends to focus, okay? The PMO tends to focus on project management. And I'll give you examples in a second. But where the business actually needs you is before that project has even started and after that project is complete. Like I mentioned, you know how up here in this process, usually until the project's approved, you don't even have a project manager assigned. If you're really lucky, you have a project manager that's involved in the idea development, business case development, pre-charter stuff, but that's not always the case. Sometimes this is a function a PMO can be involved in. And then, of course, there's the typical, okay, project manager assigned, everything's thrown over the fence from strategy definition to strategy delivery. Okay, PM, go figure it all out with an unclear or a clear strategy defined. Maybe you're lucky you got a business case that's well defined. Okay, cool. So then project management happens in whatever implementation methodology you choose. And then we get over to, okay, project over, project manager turns it over to the operations or the ongoing management function, and they're off to the other 863 projects they have to manage. Nobody is looking at the project level as to whether or not the benefits were realized or the value was measured. So this is another place the PMO can be involved. We can be involved up here to support making sure that these project managers are set up for success when they start. And then once they're gone, how do we make sure that we actually achieve the business outcomes we intended to achieve? Most projects don't achieve their intended business benefits the day they go live. If the project was to generate revenue, was to solve for a slow process, was to automate something that was manual, was to streamline the organization, was to cut costs, whatever it is, it doesn't happen the day the project goes live. It's usually a benefit that is achieved over time and a value that is realized over time. And that's why we need someone around who's making sure that we actually achieve the intended business benefits. All right, so these are two key places. I'm not saying you can't do anything in this value created stage, and we'll talk about that, but these are a couple of the places that a PMO can be useful to the entire strategy process and maybe help close some of that gap. Okay, so for years I've been saying the role of the PMO is to help the organization deliver on its strategy with the highest possible return on investment as quickly as possible. And now I'm going to show you exactly how to do it. And you might actually be surprised at where those biggest opportunities are. Okay, so you might believe that you got that all figured out. They tell you that project management's broken and you go in and fix it. But let's look at what happens. When you hear certain pain points from your business leaders, let's say you're a new PMO or you've been moved to a different part of the organization, you're setting up a PMO, or you're taking on new services and capabilities, you're meeting with different stakeholders, or like my students do in our Impact Engine PMO program, once we kind of lay the foundation of the kind of organization they're trying to build and the role of the PMO and really revamping that it's not a templates, tools, process, admin overhead cost center, but more of a business value generation center. Once we've laid that mindset and foundational work, they do an entire assessment process, which requires them to talk to all of their business stakeholders and learn very clearly what are the pain points, what are the challenges, what are the problems they're experiencing that the PMO is in a position to solve or could facilitate the solution for. So what happens is when they have those conversations, here's a lot of what they hear. Business leaders will say, I don't know what's going on in the organization. I don't even know what projects are happening, who's doing what, where my resources are. There's so many changes happening that we can't even plan out our work. Projects don't achieve the intended business results. So you'll have business leaders saying, projects are taking too long. They're costing too much. We spent all this money to put this website in place, and guess what? Nobody's actually buying the thing we were trying to sell, for example. Or we spent all this time doing all this Lean Six Sigma process improvement projects, and great, but it's actually taking us longer to get our work done now. Okay, so business benefits are not being realized. Ownership and accountability are unclear. This is something that I know many of you have heard or experienced a challenge of in the past. Every department has different priorities. I mean, is any of this resonating with all of you? Put it in the chat if you're like, yes, I'm hearing all of these things, or I've discovered all these things myself, right? These are a lot of the challenges that your business leaders will hear, your project managers will say, you're going to hear when you actually do that assessment process that's super important. Well, decisions take too long, which cause project delays. If you can't get on your sponsor's calendar for weeks, it's no wonder you can't actually get decisions made to move the projects forward. Therefore, the projects are taking too long. Resources are spread so thin that work isn't moving. Does that sound familiar to any of you? I bet it does. Projects results are unpredictable. So we have projects that should be very similar, and we should be able to predict the outcomes that we're going to see on these projects. But because of all of these reasons aforementioned, like people being spread too thinly, not having the right people on the projects, projects are taking too long, can't get decisions made. You can't get predictable results, therefore you can't get predictable business outcomes. Therefore, that whole problem on the end becomes a problem in the beginning, in that what we set up as our business case and our intended benefits and that plan we put together at the beginning is unachievable because of all these other things. Resource utilization is a problem. Unbalanced, or we just don't have enough resources. And one of my favorites, every project is a number one priority. How often do we hear that? Every project is a number one priority. Okay, so if these are the things that you're hearing, when you hear these things, and this is where it gets interesting, many PMO leaders mistakenly see these symptoms that are actually have another underlying root cause. They see these symptoms and they start building solutions to these symptoms instead of addressing the underlying root cause problem. You see, what's really going on, and your business leaders are saying that the strategy delivery process is broken, right? That's what they're saying. You need to fix project management. They say, okay, well, we have all of these problems and we see them showing up in the project management lifecycle. Therefore, it must be project management that's broken. So this is when new PMO leads are often formed, or project managers are hired, or you're getting a new opportunity. They finally are fed up with it. And by the way, by the time your business leaders act to solve a lot of these challenges, they've been dealing with them for weeks, months, years even. And because of that, they're so frustrated by the time they've hired you that the minute you start, you are already behind schedule. And I'm not saying that to scare you. It's just a fact of the business world we're dealing with change continuing to just everything. Change happens faster. We have less time. We have more impatience. We have more frustration, and we have more business problems that we're trying to solve faster for many reasons. And so because of that, what happens is that you, as a new diligent PMO leader, you say, okay, my business leaders are, one, the boss, and two, I assume they know what they're talking about. So they tell us that project management is broken. Therefore, I'm going to start fixing it by putting project management solutions in place. We don't have any templates. Everyone's doing things differently. That must be the cause of the unpredictability. Therefore, I'm going to put templates in place. Oh, we don't have tools. Everybody's doing everything manually. That's got to be the problem. Let's put some tools in place. We have an efficient process or no process at all. Everything's the wild, wild west. So let's fix that. We have people that are accidental project managers in our organization, and they need some training. And if they had training on how to do project management, that would fix everything. Okay. We don't have staffing. We don't have resources. We need more people to do this project work. And therefore, if we did that, we would be able to solve these problems. Now, I'm not saying that the more won't fix it. But what I'm saying is, when you have those symptoms we're talking about, don't know what's happening in the organization, so many changes, work can't be planned, projects don't achieve the intended business benefits, projects take too long, they cost too much, the ownership and accountability problem, every department has different priorities, decisions take too long, which delays projects, resources spread thinly, resource utilization problems, project results are unpredictable, every project is number one priority. We see all of those symptoms and we say, okay, well, if we got better at project management, then all this is going to go away. But here's what happens. We fix all of these project management problems and those symptoms don't go away. And the reason they don't go away is because we put a Band-Aid on when we actually needed a surgical intervention. So what happens is we think that our business leaders are right, that they know what they're talking about, and they said project management is broken. They said that strategy to execution gap had to be fixed. Therefore, we start fixing the project management. And the challenge is that probably only about 20% of the value you can bring to the organization fixing things is actually in the project management stage. Okay. So let's talk about why. What's really happening is you have underlying root causes that are causing these problems and setting your project managers up for failure right from the start. Okay. What you're seeing is symptoms. So let's just all agree. Can we agree that if you put smart people in a room and ask them to solve a problem and you give them everything they need to be successful, you answer their questions, you fulfill the requirements for resources, you give them the funding, and you leave them alone to do the work and solve the problem, it's going to get solved probably, right? So if generally that's the case, then it's probably not going to move the needle significantly to keep fixing good enough. And I'm not saying, because I know many of PMO leaders define their value in that more and more and more stuff. That's actually not where your real value is to the business. So if that's the case, we've got to stop focusing on fixing good enough and start focusing on those areas where our business leaders actually need us most. Okay. Now you might have a case where you don't have project managers at all, or you do need to train people, etc. Okay. Got it. That's fine. But even if you gave them no training, smart people are going to figure it out, given the time and the energy and the focus and a clear business case and a clear business problem to solve. Okay. And those that don't have the answers are going to be smart enough to know how to ask the questions to go get those answers. So I have personally trained PMO leaders that literally had zero PMO and formal project management experience before they came to me. Okay. And they're knocking it out of the park because smart people don't need certifications to do a good job. And I'm not saying, listen, I've had my PMP since 2014. I'm not saying that you don't need project management and PMP. I'm sorry, 2014. I've had it since 2004. What am I saying? I've had my PMP certification since almost the beginning of the 2000s. 2004. I've had my PMP certification. So I've had it for a long time, almost a couple of decades. And I love the fact that I have my PMP and I have content coming out of my ears. I'm always creating new stuff to maintain that certification. I do see value in it. In fact, we have an awesome PMP certification program. However, that didn't make me better at getting to business outcomes for my business leaders. Back in 2004, when I was building PMOs and I got my PMP certification, way back then, it didn't actually make me better at getting to the business results. It gave me a foundation and a knowledge base, but I was a smart person that knew how to solve problems. In fact, in 1999, when I built my first PMO, I didn't have that certification. I didn't have formal project management experience. I was on projects because I had a computer science background and we were solving IT projects and I got to be a tech lead and I got to solve all kinds of business problems. But I learned how to be a project manager through experience, not certifications. And so I was a smart person. I learned how to figure things out. I learned how to ask the right questions and understand that the most important question to ask is what business problem we're solving. All right. So I'm not saying certifications, because many of you probably have them. I'm not saying certifications are bad. I'm saying that they're an excuse. If we rely on those to determine our value, then we're going to sell ourselves short and position ourselves to rely too heavily on something that doesn't actually define success. It defines that you all are speaking the same language, which is useful, but it doesn't define success. Okay. So smart people don't need certifications to define their value in the eyes of the business leaders. Getting things done will define your value in the eyes of your business leaders. So don't confuse certifications and training or that for your teams with your value proposition in the eyes of your business leaders. All right. So what's really happening, what's really going on is that you're setting your project management teams up for failure. When they remember those 3 steps of the strategy life cycle, you're setting your project teams up for failure when you don't fix the underlying problems that are happening. And many of those problems happen before the project manager is even assigned. Okay. More projects started than you have the staff to complete. Would you guys agree that that's probably one of the root causes you have? Resources pulled in too many directions to actually be effective. Also a prioritization problem, right? Business cases and success criteria for projects are unclear. conflicting priorities that are causing confusion, strategy is unclear or uncommunicated, and business leaders are not aligned. If any of those sound like reasonable challenges that you might be experiencing in your organization, those are going to have a bigger impact on the success or failure of your projects than any training or certifications or anything you do in the project lifecycle with templates, tools, process, etc. No amount of fighting over whether a project should be managed using an implementation methodology that is more agile, more hybrid, or more waterfall, or no amount of automation of process or process itself is going to fix anything if these underlying root cause problems, and these are just examples, are happening, okay? So why is it that business leaders are telling us to fix project management if it's not the problem? Well, for many of them, it's because we've trained them or influenced them because we come from our area of strength, which is in that project management life cycle, and believe that that's what we know how to fix, therefore that must be the problem, right? Have you ever heard that, when you're, let's say, when you're, a specialist in a certain area, everything you see is a solution to that problem? So let's say, to a carpenter, everything is a hammer and a nail, right? To a plumber, everything is a wrench and piping, right? To my son, everything is a baseball or a bat, right? So depending on our perspective, to a project manager, and to many of us that grew up in project management, the solution must be in the project lifecycle, but it's not. So either we've trained our business leaders or somebody has trained our business leaders to think that the solution is in the project, or we are the ones saying, we know how to fix this. It's got to be a project management problem, okay? But there's so much more to the whole strategy lifecycle that the PMO leader can fix and the PMO can fix. And you are the best person, and your team is the best team to do this because you know how to help an organization build and execute on a plan to achieve business results. It's what you do, meaning you know how to help the organization with that strategy life cycle. All those definitions around strategy and strategic management are right in our wheelhouse. We are the best people to help solve that problem. Okay? So in order for you to properly fix this strategy process, properly close the strategy to execution gap, you are going to have to identify the root causes of each of those symptoms that you're hearing. This is what I teach my students to do in this assessment process. They have to then go spend time, once they've gathered all those inputs, and look at how do we solve those problems. That's what they do in the third step in the process. How do we solve these problems so that we're actually solving the underlying root cause business problems as opposed to the symptoms that are simply in project management? So let's look at where you can focus your support to help the organization deliver on that strategy more effectively. What do you actually do? It's like, great, Laura, fine, I believe you, but what do I actually do? All right. So keep this picture that we went over in mind as we go through the next several slides so that we can provide, solutions to those problems based on each of these stages in the process. And these are just examples. And we can spend time in the Q&A talking about your particular scenario and what problems you might be able to solve. All right. So let's look at that strategy definition process. What are some examples of things that you can do? And this is a big one. And honestly, I'm trying to think if there's any situation where this was not true. At the beginning of when you're trying to solve business problems for your organization, if you understand that anything you do in the project delivery, that strategy delivery process is going to be affected, is not going to be as successful if you haven't first fixed the strategy definition process, then it would only make sense to start here. So I highly recommend you focus your efforts here first and solve these business underlying root cause problems first before you ever even try to fix anything in the project management lifecycle, because you have to set your project managers up for success right from the start. All right, so let's look at a few examples. Strategic alignment. Strategic alignment ensures that the projects are aligned with the strategy. Okay, that's what we're trying to do. If you want to get clear outcomes, greater focus, you have to make sure that the projects that are happening are the ones that are aligned with the strategy of the organization. And you might be thinking, okay, but I'm doing tactical projects, or we oversee technical projects or projects in the IT department. Right. But they should be somehow aligned to the overall business goals of the organization. So if you don't want to use the word strategy, use the word business goals. How is this helping to move the needle in the organization? How is this helping to move the organization forward? Do you have a million special projects going on? Do you have conflicting priorities? It's likely because you don't have a process for aligning projects with the strategy of the organization. So if you want to be more strategic, you need to help your business leaders make sure that the projects they're undertaking are aligned with the most important goals of the organization. This is the very first step to getting to a proper portfolio management process, which is almost always the best place to start. And I have if you are interested in the PMO Strategies podcast, you can find it on all the players. I have a podcast specifically dedicated to start with PPM, start with project portfolio management, not necessarily tool. I never say tool first, but start with that process first, because it's almost always the underlying root cause of a lot of the challenges you're experiencing that you're trying to band-aid in the project lifecycle. So you want to align the people and the project work to the strategy so you can get those greater outcomes and greater focus. Now, the next step, and again, this is almost always one of the problems that we see, and it's one that a lot of PMO leaders struggle with themselves, and that is prioritization. So build a simple prioritization process. This often fixes our resource utilization issues, okay? So more than anything else, this will fix resource utilization issues, because you don't actually have a resource utilization issue. You know what you have? You have a 10 pounds of stuff trying to get shoved into a 5-pound bag problem, right? You have 10 pounds of projects you're trying to shove into a 5-pound capacity, right? So if you have 1 through N prioritized projects that are aligned with the strategy, you got to do that alignment stuff, and then you 1 through N prioritize those projects, you can simply draw the line through that list where the resources are maxed out. But if you have this hodgepodge of completely disorganized, not aligned with strategy, not prioritized list of projects, it's no wonder you're having a problem figuring out how resources are allocated and utilized. It's not the only problem, but when you have all kinds of different priorities and different people are being pulled in different directions, we'll talk about in a second, that's another one of these challenges. So now I know that many of you might be saying, but there's no way I can get my business leaders to prioritize, okay? And I'll tell you a quick story. Back in the day when I was managing PMOs, I did that for 15 years inside organizations. Like I said, I built my first one in 1999. This was many years later. And I realized I knew the first question I needed to ask when I started in this organization to help them build a PMO. And I was on the leadership team for this organization. I went in and I said, okay, so where do we start? We have this portfolio of existing customer initiatives happening. And I said, okay, great. So I've got the list in front of me. What's the order of priority? And what do you think they said? Well, they're client projects. Everything is a priority. I said, okay, great. So all of them are number 1 priority, all 50 of these projects. And we have unlimited time, unlimited resources, unlimited funding. Got it. And they said, no, we don't have any of that. And I said, well, then you don't have everything number 1 priority. You're going to have to make decisions to effectively deliver on these initiatives and achieve the business benefits. But prioritizing 1 through N for 50 customers, many of whom they'd had years of relationships with and experience with, and ongoing customers. So I said, okay, fine. So let's, instead of trying to get through 1 through N, let's try and put them into buckets: bucket A, bucket B, and bucket C. We'll have 3 buckets of projects that they could do. They could give me 3. So we just organized those initiatives based on all kinds of factors that mattered, like the revenue they were bringing in, like how angry the customers were being behind schedule, et cetera, and on it went, right? So we organized those projects into those 3 buckets. And for an entire quarter, we kept those bucket A, bucket B, bucket C. And whenever we talked about those initiatives or assigned resources or asked people to work on things, we did it based on that bucket A, bucket C, bucket B, C priority list. That alone sped up the entire execution of that portfolio of initiatives because people were clear, Get the A stuff on my plate done first, then go to the B stuff, then go to the C stuff. And it changed how everyone in the organization operated. This is back in the day. I printed it out, put the portfolio, instead of like all the tools we have today, I had a spreadsheet, printed it out, put it on my door outside my office, and the developers would come by on a break and they'd take a look and they'd say, oh, look at that. I have 3 of these projects on my list, but one of them is a bucket A and it's red. So what can I do to move that faster? What can I do to do that work first? That alone changed how the organization operated. Next quarter, went back to that management group and said, okay, so why don't we prioritize just the ones in bucket A, just to make sure we're taking care of the most important things first. And again, another boost in portfolio performance and throughput, simply by having everyone know what the priority of the initiatives were. Things didn't slow down, they sped up. So this doesn't have to be super complicated. Now, just so that you know, with some of those clients, this was years ago when I was a PMO leader and on the executive team of this organization, some of those clients were really angry at those at our company because their projects were so far behind schedule. Today, and in recent years, since I've run PMO Strategies for almost 10 years now, some of those very CEOs have become one-time or multi-time clients of PMO Strategies because they saw such a turnaround of the work that I did leading that PMO inside this organization to help make sure that those projects happened, that they said, I need you to come do that magic in my own organization. Okay, so this is just an example that started with 3 buckets of prioritization and huge business benefits. So for the company I worked for, and then for those C-suite executives, those CEOs of these other organizations, that when they had that business problem of needing these kinds of problems solved, they called me and said, can you come do that magic you did over here for me? Okay, so I bring that up to share that it doesn't have to be complicated to get to those results. All right, so what else can we do? Single task focus. This leads to a greater quality and greater throughput because people aren't spending all day task switching between 50 projects and can focus on one thing at a time. All right. Now, some of you are probably going to say, there's no way that that's reasonable. That is completely unreasonable. And I'm not saying that the whole company does one project at a time, but I am saying that how productive you are when you're completing a task uninterrupted is very different than if you are interrupted 15 times, okay? Imagine the developer who's sitting at their desk constantly being pinged for updates or interrupted to help with something else and debug someone else's problem, or the screaming project manager forces her to stop working on that task that she's deep into to focus on another. That task switching is very, very expensive to the human brain and to our productivity. And every time you're interrupted, your hardware needs to reboot to go back into that task. So imagine if you had to reboot your computer each time you switched between Microsoft Word, Excel, and PowerPoint, for example. That's what the brain is doing, and it can wear you out and slow you down tremendously. So multitasking, as you know, is a myth. And I hope you know that by now. And what you're really doing is task switching, and your brain has to reboot every time, and data's lost in that process because not everything stores in the database. So what you're doing is you're slowing everybody down by trying to have them work on a million things at once. So I'm not saying the whole organization does one project at a time, but I'm saying one person should be allowed to complete a task start to finish uninterrupted and before they move on to the next task. Because then that thing that took them a week before was really only 2 or 3 hours of work. They got it done, they moved it on to the next person, and now your project just sped up by 2.5 weeks because somebody was allowed to focus on one thing at a time. So look for places where you can instill a process that allows people to start to finish their work before they move on to the next thing, and you can literally have projects, not only is the quality going to be better, but you can speed projects up exponentially just by letting people focus. Now, here's another thing that is one of my favorite techniques, okay? This is one of the most underrated and most impactful solutions, okay? You ready for your mind to be blown? Start projects when you actually have the people to do them. The death by a thousand cuts experienced with task switching, like we talked about here, is only exacerbated when you have those projects piled on top of each other and, and simply you have them piled on top of each other. And so instead of simply being able to do the work that they need to do, business leaders all want their projects done at once. So if we fire the starting gun on all of them at once, they're all going to move faster, right? Absolutely not. That is not how it works. So instead, if we actually start the project when we have the people ready to do them and they can do their task focused and move on to the next one, you are going to, again, get much greater throughput on those projects. These seem like such simple things, but are you doing them? Because if you were, you would have closed the strategy to execution gap by now, because these are a lot of the problems, okay? Staggering work in this way actually leads to more projects getting done in a year with a lot less frustration. And this is a visual you need to show your business leaders. For our coaching program, our Impact Engine PMO coaching program, we have thought leaders come in and talk about things like this around prioritization and staggering, because you really need to be able to see it, show your business leaders the benefit so that they'll buy into it and let you try it. And when you do, you can 5x your productivity and your throughput on your portfolio in a single year. And that's crazy. Get 5 times the throughput from simply putting these techniques in place. Isn't that crazy? So the goal here is to set projects and teams up for success in that strategy definition process so that when the projects start, they have a much better chance of being successful. All right, now this is the area that I estimate you're only going to get about 20% of your improvement, because usually these are the places we know how to fix. But if we don't set our PMs and our project teams up for success right from the start, doing all that upfront work in the strategy definition stage, then it doesn't matter what we do here. So instead of giving, you the typical fixed project management stuff ideas, the more, templates, tools, process, I'm going to give you some examples of things you can do to continue to support the business leaders and the stakeholders so they can more effectively support your projects, so that they can, do what they need to do to get the job done. All right. So instead of adding more process, how can you streamline process to create that greater throughput and that progress? Simplify how things are done, what templates and tools you use to guide people on a journey to value delivery for the project. So before you automate and streamline, you've got to make sure that you simplify, all right? Before you add more stuff, figure out what you can take out. Your value to the organization is not in how much stuff you create and how many templates you create, how many steps in your process, how many processes, how many projects you run. And by the way, it's also not in the budget you have, right? A lot of people say, I manage a $500 million budget. Who cares? That's just talking about your spend. And that's a whole nother, presentation we need to do on measuring, communicating value. Your value is not tied to the cost for the organization. It's tied to the return on investment that you generate, which isn't in that budget number. It's actually in the ROI number. So it's not about those measurements. It's much more about how swiftly you can carry them, your stakeholders and your business leaders and your project teams, through the process to achieve those high impact results. Your goal is greater throughput, right? So educate all of your stakeholders so that they know what they're supposed to do and how to do it and why it matters. Get to that why. Why don't we start by making sure that everyone understands the business strategy that they're a part of? 95% of workforce doesn't understand the strategy. You're not going to get anywhere on anything. So what can you do to fix that? Optimize participation and help business leaders know how to properly support the teams and set them up for success. For example, if you're constantly rerouting the focus of your team members, they need to understand the consequences of their actions. Often project managers just eat that extra work and kill themselves trying to do all of that instead of asking, is this more important than that? All right. So, or you can say, okay, I would love to do that. So let me know where this is and what you want me to reprioritize so I can make that work. Or even my favorite, yes, we can do that. And here's what that will take. Or here's the impact of that to the projects we're already working on. Educating your stakeholders, and the education process is not just for the PMO leader, right? But all of your project management teams need to understand how to effectively negotiate their time so that instead of just eating it again and again when there's a problem, you can actually get to a place where you are proactively helping educate your business leaders that they must prioritize your time and the effort and what you're focused on. So project managers need to be supported and learn how to negotiate and say yes, and it's not about saying no. It's about saying yes, and we can make that change, and here's what it's going to take. Stop letting the project managers eat the changes and make sure that it's clear what they need to do to be successful. And then we want to connect all of those projects to strategy, like we talked about. You've got to answer that why question and create greater value and clarity in order to help the organization keep their eye on the ball of why they're doing the work and what needs to get done, right? And then communication. This creates that transparency and facilitates effectiveness. So why are we doing the projects? What is the priority of those projects? What are the business outcomes intended? How do we make sure everybody knows what's going on? All of these are things that can be done when you have a good prioritized portfolio in place to continue to keep everyone updated on what's going on with these projects without having to bury people in in too many meetings or heavy reports. Just tell them bottom line up front what's going on, where you need them, and what decisions are being made so they don't keep getting remade, right? All right. So what we're trying to do here in this strategy delivery stage, I'm not saying you don't need templates, tools, and process, but again, that's only going to give you about 20% of your value. Doing these kinds of things, and these are things that a PMO is really designed for, help you streamline and optimize everything so that you can get those better results. Now, in the strategy realization stage, and we already did a measure and communicate the PMO value, and that really gets into a lot of these metrics that I'm going to talk about here. So I'm just going to go quickly. That webinar is already in the repository. You can go check out. So look for success metrics. Ensure that everyone knows how success is going to be measured. Make sure that the business cases match how you're measuring at the end when the project manager is gone and the team's moved on to other things. What are you doing to measure that projects actually achieve their intended benefits? Help transition to that post-project process. Set up a good product or service for success around getting from the project completion to the operations kind of transition, and make sure that you're supporting that ongoing measurement process that we talked about. Measure impact. Confirm that the results are actually achieved. So remember what I said, that the PMO's job is to help the organization deliver on this strategy with the highest possible return on investment as quickly as possible. So we've achieved we've achieved the strategy definition clearly in the front stage. In the middle stage, we achieve the as quickly as possible. And the end stage is let's measure and make sure that we're giving the biggest return on investment. That's why we can't just measure the cost or the budget of our project portfolio, because that's only telling the one half, not even a half of the story. It's really, was this worth doing in the first place? And that comes from your return on investment measurements. And then actually learn the lessons so that you can fuel the improvement process, right? Because often, how many times have you facilitated a lessons learned process and everyone's like, great, okay, we've learned a bunch of lessons. And then they go on to the next project and they do the same exact things that they just did on the project before. And a lot of this goes back to that education process with the strategy definition in the beginning. You've got to make sure, because it's a lot of times it's your business leaders and your stakeholders that need to learn the lessons. Instead of pretending they aren't part of the problem, we need to feed that back into the things we do at the beginning of that strategy lifecycle to fix some of those underlying root causes that show up in those lessons learned. All right. So your moral of the story here is measure what matters so that you're actually seeing the results. Look at the metrics, make sure you're transitioning well to that post-project process, measure the impact, the return on investment, and use what lessons you're actually learning to feed that beginning of the life cycle. So where does this not work? I know that the yeah, but monster has crawled up onto your shoulders for some of you, and you're like, yeah, that's all great, but that doesn't work for me. Our problems are really in project management. Okay, all right. So, or we're not managing strategic projects. Please stop it. Everything is a strategic project. Remember, goals, plans, stakeholders, resources. What did we learn at the beginning when we looked at the definitions? All of it is strategic. It's just another way to say figuring out my goals and my vision and then how I want to get there. You're all strategic. You don't need to be more strategic. You just need to have that bigger picture perspective and understand how all these pieces come together. So what are the challenges to doing this? So when you have that yeah, but monster crawling up on your shoulder, I want to just address some of what you might be thinking. We don't do strategy related projects. We are internally focused. We don't have control over the strategy. We don't have that authority. I don't know how to do this. I don't have permission. Okay. Sometimes I just want to say, sometimes we have to seek forgiveness instead of permission to get things done. And if you can make a compelling case for the value that you can achieve, the return on investment for being allowed to make sure that the projects come in, setting your project managers and your teams up for success, then you are going to be well positioned to keep moving into the front part of that strategy process. All right. So let's look at this. Let me tell you why I believe you're exactly who they need. No one plans better than we do. All right. You have a specialized skill set that they need to do this well. And we already looked at the strategy and strategy management definitions, and what was the one common word in all of them? Planning, right? Okay, so if that's what we all need, then the PMO is the facilitator, not the decider. You are not the one that determines the strategy. You just facilitate getting to those answers. So do you know what strategic planning companies do? They ask a lot of questions. They facilitate dialogue that follows a very simple process, and they help them to put on paper what they want to accomplish. They help them put their goals down on paper. That's really what they do. So your job is to ask questions, help them think things through, and then you have the added benefit of kind of knowing roughly if something's bigger than a bread box or smaller. And that's kind of what they need to know when they say, but can we do this? You can actually say yes, and here's what that's going to take. You have something the strategic planning companies don't have. You have the ability to say, yes, and I know what it looks like to get there, right? That makes you incredibly valuable. So confidence breeds confidence. If you don't believe in yourself that you can do this, that this is something that you can do to support the organization, then they're not going to believe in you either. So you must believe that you have a right to sit at that table and that you have a valuable contribution to make to the organization in delivering on their strategy. And then you need to be able to back it up. You must know where and how to provide the value using the kinds of examples we've given here and solve the pain points that you've identified. The underlying root causes, not the surface things that sound like fixing project management, because they're probably not where the problem is. I like to tell people to act as if. This is something that I learned through my professional speaking career and coaching. It's act as if you want to become. What that means is it's not about faking it until you make it. It's about acting as if. And that's one trick that I learned when I was trying new things or learning different things. I asked the question, how would someone successful do this? Somebody that's good at this, what would they do? I use this with my son a lot. He says he doesn't have the confidence that he can accomplish something new. And I ask him to talk to me about someone that he knows that's successful in achieving the goals that he's trying to achieve. Tell me what that person does. Can you look at what that successful people in your organization are doing and follow suit? This has been a huge contributor to my success. Looking at what other business leaders are doing in my organizations when I was inside and seeing what success looked like and the steps they took, and then asking them about it as well. You don't have to go this alone. So start small, build credibility, and grow. I gave you an example of like, you know what? Why don't we just make sure, I don't know, let's make sure the business cases are clear when they come to you. All right. Let's make sure that we start prioritizing these projects. Let's make sure that we're educating people on the why for the strategy. Let's ask questions about how these projects tie into the overall strategy. You can take baby steps and build your credibility along the way. So remember though, that in order to do this, the PMO has got to become what I call that strategy navigator for the organization. Your job, as you can see from the strategy lifecycle process that we talked about here, is to shepherd their strategy through to completion. Okay. And the only way to do that is for you to start one step at a time, looking at the places that you can help support the entire life cycle and protect that project management process and the strategy delivery process by setting these projects up for success from the beginning and ensuring that we're actually measuring that we achieved what we intended to achieve. Okay? So your success secret to remember as you go about the rest of your day, week, month, year, is that the role of the PMO is to help the organization deliver on its strategy with the highest possible return on investment as quickly as possible. And as we transition here to questions, I know that I mentioned that Impact Engine PMO program that I have. If you are interested in learning more about that, just visit us either at PMOstrategies.com website, or you can go to iepmo.com and learn more about our Impact Engine program.
And a very special thank you, as always, to Laura for presenting with us today.
You are so welcome. Thank you so much for having me. And for all of you PMO leaders out there, welcome to becoming an impact driver. I look forward to connecting with you on LinkedIn, and feel free to join our newsletter and our community, where we are sharing all kinds of free goodies specifically for all of you in this PMO role in your organization. So I can't wait to hear how it goes trying some of these techniques in your organization.